Hi, hello, welcome. My name is Elizabeth Grace. I'm an actor, a voiceover artist and a narrator based in London in the UK. And I'm here today on the From Pemberley to Milton blog to read for you an excerpt from the wonderful anthology Elizabeth, Obstinate, Headstrong Girl. First, I'd like to thank Rita Diodata for having me here because it's an absolute privilege to be able to read for you today, and thank you, of course, for your time. I have a little confession. I've already read half of this chapter and I'll be starting from the middle of it over on the Austenesque Reviews blog. That's, I think was published on the 15th last week. So if you do want to go over there and watch it first, completely understand. You can pop back here and meet me later. There are obviously going to be some spoilers otherwise. If not, feel free to join in here and I can give you a little bit of a recap. The anthology itself has got some amazing authors involved. Christina Boyd pulled it all together, but we also have Elizabeth Adams, Christina Boyd herself, Karen M. Cox, J. Marie Croft, Amy DeRazio, Lee Dreyer, Janetta James, Christina Morland, Bo North, and last but not least, Joanna Stans. The story that I was reading and will continue to read today is Atmospheric Disturbances by Christina Morland. It's a period short story based in Regency England, and we join Elizabeth and Darcy post-engagement at her family's home in Longbourn. Darcy has just made the big mistake of calling out Elizabeth on making a fuss in front of her family, and Elizabeth hasn't taken very well to that, and Darcy, in all of his Darcyness, has stormed off. She found him in the stables, readying a horse to flee the scene, and she put all of her pride aside, chased after him, and we find them now sat under a birch tree, in the forest outside the house, and we're about to find them trying to have a conversation about how they feel, and their fears, and the tension, I suppose, that's been building up in their engagement up until now. It's a really great story. I think it highlights for me how Jane Austen's characters are so relatable, even in modern day, which, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, I understand. So I'll begin just a little bit before I stopped, just so we have a nice bit of intro and we know where we are. In acting as I have toward your family, I've only been doing what I think is best, Elizabeth. Ah, there it was. That phrase she had come to expect, for he had used it several times already during their engagement. What I think best. For all his inscrutability, she at least understood this aspect of Fitzwilliam Darcy. Sitting up straight, she met his glare with one of her own. You might have allowed yourself, in this particular instance, to be guided by one who possesses superior knowledge of the situation, perhaps your betrothed. Then again, it must be highly unusual for you to find anyone who might claim superior knowledge on any matter, large or small. He narrowed his eyes at her. If you mean to say that I ought to have consulted you before engaging a residence for your family's visit to town this spring, then I can only beg your forgiveness for my presumption. Yet even you must concede how such an arrangement would provide happiness for everyone concerned. Certainly for you. Tell me, have you measured by map the farthest one may go from Darcy House and still remain in Mayfair? For I suppose those must have been your two criteria. To place my family as far from you as possible while providing an address less mortifying to your respectability than Cheapside. She regretted her words almost the moment they escaped her lips, and regretted them more when she saw the shadow of hurt across his countenance. But he recovered quickly enough, with a grace she was coming to dislike, for he was never quite so elegant as when he was preparing to bolt. He rose and brushed the dried leaves from his breeches. Neither of us is in the proper frame of mind for discussing this matter. She jumped to her feet just as he turned to leave. Do not presume to tell me about my frame of mind. He went still, every muscle in his face taut, his shoulders a bundle of coiled tension. Even in her anger, she was tempted to reach out and touch him, to release that spring stretched almost to its breaking point. Then he strode towards her, closing the distance between them. No part of him touched her, yet she could feel the heat of him, see the bobbing of his Adam's apple beneath his loosened cravat, hear the raggedness of his, or was it her, breath. Refusing to take a step back, she craned her neck to meet his gaze. "Pardon me, Mr. Darcy. Am I making too much of a fuss for you?" He reached for her then, and she braced herself for something, a light shake of the shoulders, a rough kiss on the lips, but he halted, hands hovering inches from her shoulders. "I suppose," he said, "you will add this to your list of phrases to hold against me." "I have no idea what you mean." "First tolerable, now fuss. What are the other words I'm sure to have thrown back at me again and again over the course of our marriage?" This surprised a laugh out of her, and his entire frame relaxed. Ever so gently, he placed his hands on her shoulders and pulled her closer. "I had rather hoped," he said, lips almost at her ear, "that we would give our attention to words such as ardent and love." Oh, she had to admire his technique. Distraction was a very fine method indeed, but certainly no match for her. Just as he leaned in to kiss her, she ducked her head, brushing her lips against his jaw. With a startled exhalation, he loosened his hold just enough to let her slip out of his arms. Placing a good foot of space between them, she said, "We have more to discuss." He rubbed a hand across his face. "I do not wish to quarrel with you, Elizabeth." "Then perhaps you ought to listen to me instead." He frowned, reddened, then opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand. "You can be the very best of listeners, Fitzwilliam. Will you listen to me now?" He gave a curt nod, yet before she could think how to begin, he retrieved his coat from the ground, holding it open for her. "At least do me the favour of putting this on. You're shaking with cold, Elizabeth." She hesitated, then gave a nod of her own. She could hardly deny it that her arms and fingers were numb and stiff. Yet as soon as she slipped on the coat, she wished she had not. The wool smelled of him. There was that delicious swoop again, and his hands came to rest lightly on her arms. Unable to help herself, she leaned back against him, revelling in his warmth. "Come," he said, taking her by the hand and leading her back to what she had decided was their tree. "Let us sit." As they once again settled themselves on the ground, he had figured out what to do with his arms this time. One he slipped around her shoulders, the other he wrapped lightly about his knees. She asked, "Will it always be this way?" "Do you mean will I always give in to you so easily?" "You give in to me." She tried to shrug off his arm. "I have given in to you. Here I am, wearing your coat, wrapped in your arms, an obedient little wife-to-be." "Yes, terribly obedient," he muttered as she finally pulled out from beneath his arm. They looked at each other and she sighed. "Did I not pledge to tease and quarrel with you as often as I could?" "You are as good as your word." Then, with a sigh of his own, "I know you are angry with me, and perhaps with some reason." "Oh, thank you for that." He scowled, but continued doggedly. "Yes, I ought to have spoken with you first about leasing a London residence for your family. And no, I ought not to have accused you of making a fuss." She closed her eyes, the hurt flooding back all at once. How awful. To be sitting all the way across the drawing-room from him, watching as he stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed, all hauteur and disdain. How cold his voice had been when he'd spoken those words to her. "It is just a house, Elizabeth. Do stop making a fuss." And in front of all of her family. And Miss Bingley, Mr. Bingley too. True, she had been rather blunt in her rejection of his generosity, but only because he had failed to heed her previous, gentler refusals. "I was making a fuss," she admitted. "I'm beginning to wonder if it's the only way I may get you to listen to me." "When do I not listen to you?" Did you not just praise me for being the very best of listeners? He shook his head. This is why at times I can make no sense of you, Elizabeth. You contradict yourself. You are the very best of listeners, when what I have to say does not inconvenience you. He gaped at her. What is that supposed to mean? Just as I have said. You had decided already that it suited you more to tuck my family away in some respectable house not too far and yet not too near to your own London residence. Ah, London residence, Elizabeth. I was thinking of everyone involved. Bingley has no house of his own in town, as you well know. To invite the Bingleys, as well as the Bennets, to have so many guests residing with us all at once. We Bennets have managed with tighter quarters each time we have visited the Gardiners. Which is precisely why I decided renting a separate residence would be for the best. Would you ever allow such a liberty to be taken on your behalf, Fitzwilliam? What has that got to do with anything? And how is it a liberty to other Bennets too? Not allowed some pride? These past 2 months you have patronised my mother, sisters, and even at times my father, in ways I find difficult to— Oh, I see. I'm to show them kindness, yet do nothing at all for them. Perhaps you may advise me on how I am to act toward them, as I am apparently not meeting with your approval. You might try talking with them, as you talk with me. Instead you are cold and silent, just throwing money at them. Throwing money? As if they are a leaky roof or unimproved acreage. Oh, for God's sake, Elizabeth. To be frank— Have you been anything else? To be frank, I'm surprised you would discuss matters of money with them, and yet you just told me I ought to talk with them more. That is not what I mean. No, I understand your meaning, Elizabeth. You suppose I have not changed, that I'm capable only of arrogance, conceit, and a selfish disdain for the feelings of others. Oh, so now you've decided to throw my ill-considered words back at me. She put her hands to her face, pressing the heels of her palms to her stinging eyes. It had mattered not. The tears fell, and fell hard. A downpour she could not control, only endure. Yet she still tried to outrun it, or at the very least hide. She scrambled to her feet and spun away from him, as if that might do any good. Surely the sight of her trembling shoulders would be just as painful to him as her tears. When she managed to check her crying, she looked about and gasped. It was snowing. Softly, lightly, just enough to make the air sparkle and the earth appear fresh again. They were in no more danger of freezing to death than they had been a few minutes earlier, less so since the wind had died down. Yet she expected, any moment, that he would repeat his order to return to the house. Instead, she felt his tentative pat on the back, a gesture so awkward, so tender that she began to laugh as well as cry into her hands. Elizabeth? His voice conveyed all the confusion, distress, and weariness she herself felt. Poor man, she managed, turning enough to peek at him through her fingers. The snow had begun to turn his hair white. I rather think I ought to comfort you. I would not be averse. He gently pried her hands from her face, to a certain kind of consolation. In a flash, her arms were about his neck, her face buried in the crook of his shoulder. I'm ruining your fine attire, she said, even as she used the sleeve of his coat to wipe her nose. What trouble I am making for you today. No trouble, he murmured, kissing her hair. Just a fuss. She laughed against his chest, then leaned back to study him. Here was yet another variation on Fitzwilliam Darcy. Eyes clear and wide and searching, hair wet from snow, curling about his ears and rumpled on top, as if he had run his hands through it one too many times during their argument. Had he ever have been so handsome as he was in this moment? She, on the other hand, must have looked a fright, red nose and tear-stained cheeks, hair sticking out every which way. Yet he gazed at her with that same intensity she had once mistaken for disapproval, an intensity that sent a jolt of heat through her now. Still, she remained too contrary, and still too afraid to tip her head back for the kiss they both wanted. This," she said, indicating her blotchy face, "is the woman you are marrying in 3 days." "Thank God," he said, leaning in for a kiss that she stopped with an index finger to his lips. I know, she murmured at his expression of dismay. "I'm such a difficult creature. You're wishing you'd caught someone more compliant. Perhaps Miss Bingley, when you had the chance?" He nipped the pad of her finger. "And you are angling for a compliment of my denial." "I simply want to make certain," she continued, dodging another kiss, "before you regain the upper hand." "And here I thought you had taken that position." "That we have resolved our differences." He raised his eyebrows. "Or at least the question of London and my family." With a sigh, he let his hands fall to his side. "This matters a great deal to you." "Yes. Or rather, no, not the house in London. Not precisely." "I appreciate your generosity, Fitzwilliam, truly. Yet it feels—" She hesitated, loath to start another round of quarrelling. "Cold," he said quietly. "Contemptuous." She gazed up at him. "Yes, cold." He let out a short, curt laugh. "These last few days I suspected you were growing angry with me, but for an entirely different reason. I thought—" This time he hesitated. She grabbed one of his hands and kissed it. "Do not fear to speak openly to me now. I'm all fussed out for the day." He smiled. "I thought perhaps you were angry at me for giving gifts to everyone in your family but you." "What? You supposed me jealous?" He raised his eyebrows at her tone. Yes, I know. No more fusses. Allow me to state quite calmly that jealousy is not among my many flaws. Indeed, I interpreted the lack of gifts as a sign of your respect. A rather unconventional sign of respect, to be sure, but a sincere one. Precisely. I hardly knew how to explain this behaviour to myself, except to acknowledge that I had nothing to give you, besides my time, that did not feel like a cheap form of flattery. Nothing but your time, she smiled. Were you any other man, I might call such a speech arrogant. I'm surprised to find myself excluded in that regard. I believe you once took great pleasure in attaching that word to my character. No, never pleasure. Besides, I have given up my old habits, or at least some of them. Now that you are to be my husband, only favourable adjectives will do for you. Except, I suppose, when you're angry with me. Her smile slipped. Not angry. At least not now. I only wish, she bit her lip. I wish you might show some small measure of warmth toward my family. I have made an attempt, Elizabeth. Have I not attended every one of the dinners and card parties your mother and aunt have arranged for us? Yes, though as I have said to you before, if you're only going to go so you might stand about silent and unhappy, I would have you decline every invitation. You once exhorted me to practice, so I have been. Have you? I suggested practicing conversation, not the purchasing of gifts that, by your own admission, serve as a cheap form of flattery. He flushed, started to turn, then halted halfway. She was struck by the sight of him, staring down at his hands. Here was yet another variant of this man she had once thought incapable of self-doubt or reflection. Forgive me, she said quietly. I am not being fair. On the contrary. You found me out, and made it impossible, I might add, for me to give you the wedding gift I had planned to present upon our arrival at Pemberley. She laughed. Oh, I suppose I might be persuaded to accept it. Then, in a more serious tone, I do not believe all forms of gift-giving are but a cheap form of flattery to you. Your sister has told me of your generosity to her and to all who live at Pemberley, and I do not suppose you think so little of them. Yes, and yet. Well, I do not know what to say to any of them, Elizabeth. Even with Georgiana, I sometimes have so little to say. The gifts, He shook his head. They absolve you from the responsibility of talking when you feel you would rather not talk at all? She finished for him. He looked so discomfited by this analysis of his character that she took pity on him and brushed her lips against his cheek. I hereby pledge, she murmured against his skin, so warm in spite of the cold, to teach your sister all my quarrelsome ways, so that you may then find it easier to speak with her too. He laughed, and she felt all the heat of the sun that was not, on this wintry day, readily apparent. Given this sudden burst of happiness, she wished she could have swallowed the question that came tumbling from her lips. Why is your character so altered in general company? With me, with Mr. Bingley, and I suspect with a few others, you are yourself. And yet with most people, certainly with my family, you seem a different man. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, my father used to present my mother with a different gift nearly every day during the last year of her life. She stared up at him, hardly knowing how to respond to this statement that was at once a misdirection and a heartfelt response to her question. Most days he gave her fresh-cut flowers, he continued, absently brushing the snow from his hair, then hers. But also books she would never read, stationery she would never use, jewels she would not have time enough to wear. Elizabeth was certain she had seen his parents' portraits at Pemberley, yet when she tried recalling their faces, she pictured her own parents. There was a time, long ago, when her father too had brought home trinkets for his wife. When had the gift-giving stopped? My mother was a very sickly woman, Darcy said after a long silence, and I used to suppose my father gave her these gifts as a means of improving her spirits. I remember telling her no more than a fortnight before her death that she ought to be grateful for all he did to her. Oh, Fitzwilliam. I am grateful, my mother told me, smiling, though I cannot think now that she could stand to smile at me after I had said such a thing to her. The agony of his expression, guilt, regret, self-loathing, made Elizabeth swear she would bear without complaint every one of his cold spells, if only she never again had to see such suffering on his features. Only now, after your condemnation of my behaviour, do I wonder. He squeezed shut his eyes, then shook his head. For all the gifts he gave her, I never once heard him offer the words of affection. He never, in my presence at least, said, I love you. He looked at her then, his grey eyes luminous, light and dark, sun and storm. I love you, Elizabeth. And oh, how she loved him. Had her throat not constricted, she would have told him so. As it was, she could only gaze up at him and hope he understood. He must have, for he smiled, not his stiff, public smile or a devilish teasing grin. No, this smile was pure incandescence, a fire lit from within, and she supposed herself was the only person in the world fortunate to have witnessed it. Surely, she whispered, when she at least found her voice, your father, even if he could not say the words. Oh, he loved my mother. Of that I have no doubt. He was not a cruel or heartless man. Indeed, he was all that was respectable and good. But he did not know how to speak of the things that truly mattered to him. He could go on for hours about ledgers or Napoleon or the best way to raise a horse, but to give voice to his feelings? No. A gentleman did not speak of such things. She wrapped her arms about his waist and placed her ear against his chest, listening to his breath, to his heart, to those inner workings she so rarely heard. I do not mean to excuse myself, Elizabeth, to say it is because of my father that I sometimes behave as I do, yet I am something like him. I do not find it easy to explain myself. Yes, and something like your mother too." She placed a feather-light kiss just above his cravat on the bare skin of his throat. "I will give you words of kindness and affection all the days we have together, Fitzwilliam." He held her tight, saying nothing. "And other kinds of words too," she added, "when the mood suits." "Naturally." Then, after a pause, "You ask me why I'm a different man with others. But what if I'm not?" She pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "For all that I've tried to change, for all the ways I will continue to live by your lesson, Elizabeth, I remain the man you accused me of being when I first proposed." No, I was wrong about you at Hunsford. I did not fully understand you then." He raised a brow. "Do you fully understand me now? For I can say with certainty that I do not fully understand you." "Very well. I do not fully understand you. But I know at least enough to say that those words I used, I regret them. And I always will. You are not arrogant, conceited, or selfish." She offered a crooked smile. "Just presumptuous enough to arrange my family's stay in London without consulting them or me." "Yes, I am that man. As well as the man who dreads your mother's chit-chat." "Oh, but we all dread that. Yet I've endured it for 20 years. I dare say you can manage for the month they will spend with us in town." "Oh, very well," she added, smiling at his expression of alarm. "We will leave the decision to my parents. If my mother can be persuaded to accept your generous offer, I will say nothing else on the matter." He smiled his thanks, and then his countenance grew serious. "We may laugh about this now, but I remain, Elizabeth, the man you will sometimes find disdainful and cold. There will come a day when all we have said and felt here will fade to distant memory, and we will argue again." Again and again, I am sure. She thought of her parents, of how she had never heard them argue. Carp and complain, mock and neglect, yes, but grapple with each other's true feelings, confront each other's faults, loving each other all the while, no. At least, I hope we will argue again and again. He raised his brows. "Oh, I do not truly enjoy quarrelling with you, Fitzwilliam, but if it keeps you from turning your back on me—" "I would never do that." "If I had not chased after you, as you put it, made a fuss, you would have left Longbourn today without a word to me. Tomorrow, you would have called on my family, cool and polite, pressing upon us both the pretence that neither of us was hurting." He opened his mouth, presumably to disagree, then promptly closed it. She saw then how his teeth chattered, how cold he must have been, giving up his coat for her. Shrugging out of it, she said, her own lips trembling, "Your turn now." But he refused to wear it, of course, and so it was that they started back to the house, his coat slung across her shoulders, her arm wrapped about his waist, both of them thinking of the other, more potent ways they might, in the days to come, keep each other warm. Longbourn in sight, he said, "Knowing how much I have pained you, I wish I could promise never again to behave as I have today." "And I wish I could promise never again to make such a fuss over small matters." They stopped and stared at each other. "It would be a falsehood," he said quietly. "Yes." With all the solemnity of a man headed to the gallows, he asked, "Can you still marry me, knowing that I cannot completely change for you?" At last, a crack in the ice. It would never fully melt, this fear that he would one day fall out of love with her, but to know that he too dreaded the loss of her affections, well, she felt oddly grateful for this reciprocal fear. What a strange thing, this love. It thrived not on the absence of discord, but from the sharing of it. "So long as you can still marry me, knowing me for who I am, and who I will always be." He kissed her hair. "Clever, beautiful and exasperating? Yes, of course. But also, she grinned up at him, squinting at the sudden appearance of the sun. Did I ever tell you how Lady Catherine described me during her unexpected visit to Longbourn? He made a face. I do not think I want to know. She called me an obstinate, headstrong girl. How wrong she was. She arched a brow, resorting to cheap flattery after all. On the contrary, you are no girl, Elizabeth. Now, for God's sake, let me kiss you. Obstinate, headstrong woman that she was, she did not. She kissed him first. Thank you very much. That's the end of that story. The wonderful story by Christina Morland. The audiobook of Elizabeth, Obstinate, Headstrong Girl goes on sale, I believe, at the end of August. Please buy a copy if you enjoyed that. It was my absolute pleasure to be reading for you today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me and let me be part of it. I really, really hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed reading it, and yeah, I hope to see you soon. Bye.